For months now, we've seen a disturbing surge in homegrown anti-Semitism, and for months we've seen the Albanese government shamefully just sit on its hands, allowing it to flourish, really. This anti-Semitic behaviour is no longer restricted to the fringes of society. Some of it's gone mainstream, and it's all been on Albo's watch. Joining me now to discuss this is Liberal MP Julian Leeser. Good to talk to you again, Julian.
Thanks, Chris.
Now, you've focused in a speech on the Australian Human Rights Commission, and I think you're so right to do this. I mean, this is the body that really exists to try and counter things like racism and racial discrimination, yet they've been virtually silent on this.
Yeah, I can't believe that in a time when we've had unprecedented levels of anti-Semitism in our country, where there's been a 738% increase in anti-Semitism, where the Victorian police have reported that 70% of their racially motivated crimes are directed at the Jewish community that they've had in the last few months, that the Human Rights Commission has said absolutely nothing about anti-Semitism, and indeed the only thing they've said about some of the terrible protests and street activity we've seen here is to remind people of the rights of demonstrators. The Human Rights Commission is supposed to protect the rights of all Australians, and it's particularly supposed to stand up against racial prejudice, and yet it's been silent on anti-Semitism.
Now, you're a member of the Jewish community. You know what's going on. I speak to people in the Jewish community in Sydney and in Melbourne of late. They are feeling isolated, stranded. They're copping all this anti-Semitism. There's no lead from the government or even really from the policing authorities.
I think too often in this country in recent months, we've seen people who are charged with administering institutions who failed to stand up for what's right. I can't believe that no one was charged after the Opera House protests. I think if the police had cracked down on those protesters, what we've seen subsequently wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, that was right at the start, but there's been many opportunities since. I know from my personal dealings, for instance, that the Prime Minister is cognisant of the rise of anti-Semitism, yet he's doing nothing about standing up and making a bold statement or doing something about it.
Well, I'd like to see the Prime Minister call in the Human Rights Commission and say to them, what are you doing to stand up against anti-Semitism? This is a federal government agency whose job it is to protect people from racial prejudice. And yet they said nothing about doxing. They've said nothing about the anti-Semitic protests. They've said nothing about the drive-through Jewish suburbs. They've said nothing about the intimidation that Jewish students are facing on campus. Nothing. And instead, the only thing they've said is we've got to protect the rights of demonstrators. And of course, they had all those staff members writing in, basically repeating the Hamas talking points, saying that the Commission should have said more, defending what had gone on by the terrorist attacks in Israel on October 7.
Surely they don't have any right to exist anymore. Surely they should be abolished. There have been serious calls for this in the past, but we've seen all the trouble that they've created under 18C. We've seen the sort of process as punishment that they've meted out along the way. During the pandemic, they were nowhere in standing up for individual rights and freedoms. And now with this standout case of anti-Semitism, as you say, the very essence of the stuff they're supposed to be there to protect people from, they've been silent and abrogated their responsibilities.
If a body like the Human Rights Commission is not standing up at this time, what is the point of having the Human Rights Commission?
Yeah, well said, Julian. Yeah, thanks for joining us, Julian. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.
Julian Leeser, the Liberal MP, and we'll try and get a response from the Australian Human Rights Commission soon.